good to see everyone, and this is we're wrapping up our series on the secret life of a Christian and talking about loneliness today, and I'm kind of reflecting upon this series, and one of the things that I've gotten a tremendous amount of feedback on this sermon series in a lot of positive ways, and so I am just thankful for the ways that God is working in your life and the ways that people have been sharing with me how some of these things have made them rethink things and change perspective on things or address some things in their lives that they had not been looking at before. And I've been encouraged these past few weeks, so I'm kind of sad to be leaving the series and ending it. But we're going to talk about loneliness this morning. Did anybody see the Time magazine article that came out about the 10 ideas that are changing your life? Has anybody seen that issue or heard about it? You may have heard about it. They talk about the 10 ideas that are changing our lives. One of those ideas is that 28% of Americans today are living solo. That means that more and more Americans are choosing to live alone than ever before in our American history. So we have moved basically from a more community-centered agrarian culture in America to a much more highly individualistic, and now what we're starting to see as a cultural trend is that we're living alone. More and more people are living alone. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that we're lonely. Some of us like being alone. Some of us are like, "Really, get me away from the people." I also noticed so I was thinking about this. I was actually preparing this message, and I occasionally go to Panera Bread, and I'll go and prepare sermons there because I can get away from the office and really zero in. And even though I'm in a busy place, I tend to be able to focus and not be distracted. And as I was preparing this message, I looked around me as I was doing this, and I'm sitting alone at my table, cup of coffee, computer, and I looked around, and every single other person in the restaurant was also alone. And I looked around, and everywhere I could see, everybody was sitting by themselves at a table. And so I did a little psychology, I did a little psychological observation, went back to my college training. I started to make notes. And so I counted the closest 10 people around me, and I took to the next 10 people around me. They were all sitting by themselves, and 5 of those folks were on computers. 2 were on cell phones, either texting or emailing. One was talking, one was either texting or emailing. 2 people were reading either a newspaper or a book, and 1 person was actually eating a bagel. Nobody else was eating. It was just 1 out of 10 was actually eating, was there to eat. And I thought that was a strange thing to look around and just to see that everybody was by themselves. And that's it's part of our culture, that we're very individualistic, that we're doing our own things. And it's interesting because psychology also teaches us, if you remember from high school or college, that when we don't have meaningful human connections, that we as humans tend to go towards and gravitate towards artificial connections. If you don't, just a reminder, how many people saw the movie Castaway? You remember the movie Castaway, right? Tom Hanks, living solo. He's on an island by himself, surviving. Who does he befriend on the island? Do you remember who he befriends? Wilson, the volleyball, remember? An artificial object. So when we don't have the meaningful human connection, we naturally will create an artificial connection. This is Psych 101 here. And that's what happens. And I wonder how much, and so this made me think, okay, how much is technology becoming that artificial connection? I'm not saying it's all of it, but is technology becoming our artificial connection to other human beings rather than real human connection? And so I think that's something for us to be aware of as we see this trend and as we continue to live out this in our society. So what is loneliness? Because I certainly didn't feel lonely when I was in Panera by myself. So, because you and I, we can be in a crowd and feel profound loneliness, or we can be by ourselves and be like, yeah, I'm away, thank God. We appreciate the solitude. So it's not that. So we all feel loneliness. We all experience it at some point in our lives if we're not already experiencing. A Duke study did a study, and they have found that the people reporting that there's no significant connection with someone else in their life has tripled over the past 20 years. About 1 out of every 4 Americans now are saying, I've got no meaningful connection with another human being. Now, I can know lots of people, and I can talk to lots of people, but I might not have a meaningful and authentic relationship with 1 or 2 people. And so there are more Americans experiencing that as well. And so that's happening, and we all experience that. If you've ever changed jobs, you've experienced a little bit of that, right? Because you leave all your old relationships and you go and you haven't built the new meaningful relationships. If you've changed homes, you've experienced that. If you've gone to college, freshman year of college is probably one of the toughest years socially, because everybody that you have a meaningful connection with is now no longer in your life, and you have all these people that you don't have meaningful connections with, and you've got to rebuild those relationships again. And so profound loneliness affects a lot of college freshmen as well. So we've all experienced that. So what loneliness is, really, if you haven't already heard it, is it's a lack of that meaningful, authentic connection with another human being. And it doesn't have to be with a lot of people. It just has to be with a few, maybe even one or two people in your life that will tell whether or not you and I are experiencing that. Now, the psalmist that we're reading this morning, if you listened, did you hear the loneliness of the psalmist? Like a bird on a roof, like an owl in the wilderness. What the psalmist was experiencing, the scholars believe that this psalmist who wrote this was one of the Israelites who were in captivity. That's meaning that there was a time in Israel's history where they were conquered by foreign governments and foreign armies, and some of the Israelites were then taken away in captivity into another land, into a foreign country, and they were held in captivity there. And if you listen to the psalm and as you read it, you'll notice some indications. It's as though this person feels like they're in solitary confinement. They're living solo. They're in exile. They're in captivity. And so they're feeling profound loneliness and being alone and being away from everything they've known in terms of their God, in terms of their people. And here they find themselves in this place where they lack that meaningful relationship. But there's a couple things that the psalmist understands, even in his or her loneliness. And the one thing is that the psalmist realizes that they're not alone. We are not alone. Did you notice that the psalmist says and goes and talks to who? Who does the psalmist talk to? Who's the psalmist talking to here? It's easy. It's a Sunday school. What's the answer in Sunday school? God. There you go. All right, good. We're good. You're still awake. All right. It's God, right? So the psalmist is saying, I still have a connection with God. I still have a relationship with God. God has not left me. I can still cry out to God. We also heard in the gospel lesson here this morning, think about Jesus. Jesus experienced loneliness more profoundly than probably you and I will ever experience. If you think about it, Jesus was betrayed by Judas, right? So he had a betrayal. And then because of that betrayal, he was then arrested with his, you remember all his disciples were with him until he got arrested. And then what did they do after his arrest? They took off. They deserted him and left him to face Pilate and the chief priests and the scribes, and then ultimately to become crucified at the hands of the Roman soldiers. And it's that moment that we heard about in the gospel lesson this morning, that Jesus was on the cross and saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think that was probably the moment of the most profound loneliness that Jesus was expressing. Because at this point, it was as though God were even turning God's back on Jesus. The feeling of abandonment and loneliness, not just by people, but by God. And so this profound loneliness takes over Jesus, and that's his cry. And yet at the same time, who is he crying out to? He's crying out to God. He knows that God still exists, that God is still there. The other thing that the psalmist helps us to see is that there's also always a future with God. That even if things look despairing, even if I'm in captivity and exile and lonely, that there is still a future that God has. That there's a better future that God has. That there's a hope in a different circumstance, in a different future that he or she can look forward to. That even in that despair or that pit, there is a way out. It's interesting that psychology is also saying that, it used to be that they believed that depression was what created loneliness, that because you're depressed, you become lonely. And actually, they're rethinking that today, and they're saying that it's actually our loneliness that creates the depression. That it's actually our lack of significant relationship and connection and authentic and meaningful relationship with others that can lead us into depression. And that place can become a pit, a despairing place, a feeling of solitude and exile, and we can echo the words of the psalmist. And yet, even in that, it's hard to sometimes see our way out of it, isn't it? It's hard to understand or see that there's actually a future, or there's a hope, or that there's something better than where we're at right now. It's hard for us to see that maybe God does have a plan for us. You know, I was canoeing with some young people when I was young, a lot younger than I am today anyway, early 20s. Friends and I, we went out canoeing, and we went on a section of the C&O Canal, and there's parts of the C&O Canal that still have water in it. And it's a great place to take a canoe, and it's a summer day, and just meandering down through the C&O Canal, and it's, for a young adult, it's not real exciting to canoe on the C&O Canal. It's just placid waters. So when you're a young adult, what do you do to entertain yourself in a canoe on placid waters where there's no excitement? You begin to create your own, rough waters. You begin to create your own adventure in that moment. And so we began, starts out lightly splashing each other and then trying to tip each other's canoes over. And there's several canoes out there with two of us in each canoe. And we're trying to now submerge each other's canoes and fill each other's canoes with water, and we're having a great time. And finally, sure enough, one of the canoes, two guys in one of the canoes, they go in. They both go over. And I'll never forget one of the guys, he starts to panic because he couldn't swim very well, and he could stay up above the water, but he wasn't real good at swimming, and so he was beginning to panic. And he was trying to make his way back to the canoe, and you could just see the terror on his face. And he's like, you can see him struggling to get it back, and he can't see how he's going to get out of the situation. He's panicking. Finally, somebody in the other canoe yells out, "Stand up!" He still didn't hear it. The message was sent, but he couldn't hear the message because he was so wrapped up in trying to get back to the canoe, and he couldn't hear it. And so finally, somebody yells even louder, "Stand up!" And so it registered, and he stood up, and he was in about water up to about here. You see, I think sometimes we look at our circumstances like he did, whereas God has a different perspective. God has a perspective that says, just stand up. It's okay. It's going to be okay. And then we realize, it maybe is not as bad as I'm thinking it is. It's maybe not as bad as I'm creating it to be. Now, the psalmist was certainly in a bad situation. Yet that's what impresses me about the psalmist. The psalmist is still, the faith of the psalmist takes the long view. The faith of the psalmist says, there is a God who has a future for me and for Israel, and it's going to happen. That I'm not going to be stuck here in this place forever. And that hope and that faith is what helps that psalmist in the midst of this loneliness and exile, to remember that God has a different perspective on life and what's going on in this life than we do. So those are the ways that we can connect with God. And our relationship with God can help us in our loneliness, yet at the same time we also still need, because we still need human connection, don't we? We still need to have a meaningful and authentic relationship with another human being. We all need that. In fact, God created us that way, designed us that way. God put us in each other's lives. We are created. God didn't put us on the earth solo. God made us for other people. So how do we do that? Well, let me give you a few tips to being together, or tips to get togetherness. And there are just a few things I want to share real quickly here this morning. One is that we need to make a decision within our own thinking to stop throwing pity parties. So part of it is an internal decision that I need to make to say to myself, I'm not going to keep talking to myself this way. I'm not going to keep throwing myself a pity party. I'm not going to continue to further that thought process. If you remember when we talked about anger a couple weeks ago, that there's a thought process that goes into us feeling angry. There's also a thought process that goes into us feeling lonely or experiencing that or feeling despair. And if you remember that, we had our belief, there's our belief, and then there's our thoughts, right? And our thoughts are that, and it's our thoughts that actually lead to our feelings. You see that? We often think our feelings create our thoughts, but it's often the other way around. So part of our staying in that place of loneliness and despair is sometimes our own thoughts. And when we're not connecting with other people, our natural assumption is what? We often think, well, there must be something wrong with who? Me, right? That's what we think. That's our self-talking. That's not reality. That's actually us saying to ourselves, there must be something wrong with me, and so I'm the problem, or then I get further into those feelings of loneliness or despair, when in reality, in fact, it may have nothing to do with me. It may just have to do with the circumstances of my life that I'm in right now. And it may have nothing to do with who I am. But if I keep telling myself that, that will not help. The other thing that we can do is we actually can begin to take the initiative to seek out other relationships. A lot of times I find that and I experience this as well, and I think what we do is we tend to think, well, I'll wait for them to call me, right? I'll wait for them to email me. I'll wait for them to invite me. And so we wait and we wait and we wait, and it never happens. I would suggest to you that there's somebody else out there that's doing the same thing that you are. If you think about it, they're waiting, they're hoping, they're thinking, well, if they would just invite me. And so who's going to take the initiative? You see, sometimes we need to be the one to take the risk, to take the initiative to seek out those relationships. And the more important thing in that, though, is the other thing. And the other thing is we actually have to take some risks in those relationships to actually be authentic. See, we need meaningful relationships. And if we're not willing to take the risk to be authentic with that other person, we're never going to move to a place of meaningful relationship. Does that make sense? Because we're often holding back. And unless we're willing to take some of those risks, we won't ever experience the meaning of relationships and build trust in relationships that we all need. I don't think technology is going to do that for us. I don't think technology is going to do that for us. I think technology can help keep us connected, but it won't help us be connected. Does that make so? That's what I think. Facebook actually, Facebook has a psychologist on staff. Did you all know that? They have psychologists on their staff, and they study how we use Facebook. And Facebook users, if you read Pastor's Ponderings this week, you'll notice that the ideal number of friends to have, do you remember? Anybody read it? What's the ideal number of friends to have on Facebook? 302. All right, good. Somebody read it. All right, good, yeah. Star on your chart in this class. All right. 302, because with 302 friends, you don't look too, desperate for friends, but you also don't look too pathetic because you don't have enough friends, so there's this ideal number. So don't go look at how many friends I have this week because it won't look good. It's not 302. So that's part of it. Yet in reality, as they look at our actual interaction on Facebook, we only interact with a handful of people. Or actually a couple dozen people. Women actually 26, men 17. And out of those 26 for women, there's about 16 that women actually connect with more regularly. And for men, out of the 17, there's actually about 10 people that they connect with more regularly. It also tells us something about men and women, doesn't it? In our relationships, and our needs, and what we need in relationship. So I don't think technology is going to do that. We actually have to seek out, and be in connection, human, real connection with other people. You see, it's possible, folks. It's possible to have a whole lot of friends and be lonely. It's possible to be around people all the time and still not have a meaningful connection. Because you and I cannot have a meaningful connection with 100 people or 50 people. Or 20 people. We have to seek out those relationships that we can go deeper with. And we need to have those folks in our lives. There was another guy who wrote in the Bible. His name was Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was a prophet. And you want to take a guess, given all that we said this morning, who Jeremiah was writing to, speaking to? He was speaking to the people of Israel in exile, in captivity. So Jeremiah was writing, and he was speaking to the people like the psalmist in Psalm 102, and he was saying to them these words in Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. Those were the words of Jeremiah to the psalmist of 102. Those are also the words that God could have easily spoke to Jesus on the cross. When Jesus was crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you, God? Why am I experiencing this profound loneliness?" These words were equally true, were they not? Did God not have a plan for Christ? Did God not have a future and a hope for Jesus, even in that moment on the cross? You see, there's always a Sunday when there's a Friday. God always has a future and a hope for us, no matter where we find ourselves. Amen.